So in John chapter 8, so far, Jesus has called himself the light. Jesus has called himself the light of the world in verse 12. Another major thing that we've had Jesus talk about in John chapter 8 is what he calls being from above. John 8:23. You are from below, I am from above. And we very briefly discussed how this relates to themes such as the saints being gathered to Christ and the new heavens and the new earth and things like that. But now we find ourselves in verse 31 of John chapter 8, and here we read this. So Jesus was saying to those Jews who had believed him, "If you continue in my word, then you are truly disciples of mine, and you will know the truth, and the truth will make you free." Now notice that Jesus is not talking to, in verse 31, the individuals who do not believe in him. He's talking to those who have believed in him in verse 31. And he says to them that if they will continue in his word, then they'll be his disciples. You see here that though they believe, that alone isn't all that Jesus expects of them. He expects them to continue in the word. And the word "if" at the beginning of that sentence indicates a choice that they can make. They can continue in the word and truly be a disciple, or they can fail to continue in the word and not be considered a disciple, right? This is similar to something that Jesus said in Matthew chapter 7. If you'd like to go there, we'll take a look at verses 21 down to verse 27. He says in Matthew chapter 7 and verse 21, "Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' will enter the kingdom of heaven, but he who does the will of my Father who is in heaven will enter." This could be very descriptive of those who were listening to Jesus' Sermon on the Mount who believed in him, and those in John 8 who were listening to what he was saying and believed in him there. Because they might say, "Lord, Lord," but those aren't the ones who enter the kingdom of heaven. It's those who do the will of the Father. He goes on to say in verse 22, "Many will say to me on that day, 'Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and in your name cast out demons, and in your name perform many miracles?' And I'll declare to them, 'I never knew you. Depart from me, you who practice lawlessness.'" There are a lot of people who do religious sort of things, outward sort of things. Prophesy, cast out demons, perform miracles. But what Jesus says, if they don't do the will of the Father, then he never knew them, even though they might do those sorts of outward things. Moving on in verse 34, he says, "Everyone who hears the words of mine and acts on them." That word "act," or that word "and," is a very important word, kind of like we talked about this morning. Because it's not just enough to hear the word, but it's to hear and to act upon it. He may be compared to a wise man who built his house on the rock. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and slammed against that house, and yet it did not fall, for it has been founded on the rock. Everyone who hears these words of mine and does not act on them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. The rain fell, the floods came, the wind blew and slammed against that house, and it fell, and great was its fall. Jesus had many individuals that followed him in the first century during his ministry. But as we saw in John chapter 6, many of the ones that followed him were just doing so to see some sign that he might perform, or to receive some sort of meal from Jesus miraculously. They weren't following Jesus because they had been convicted by his teaching. Many were following him just because of the signs that he had done, which is one reason why in passages like in Mark, Jesus would heal somebody, and then he'd tell them, don't go and tell anyone what you've seen me do, right? Just go present yourself to the priest and go about your business. Because Jesus didn't want people following him just because he could do a sign. He wanted people to follow him because they loved God and they believed his teaching. So in John 8:31, Jesus says, "If you continue in my word, then you are truly disciples of mine." We have to be sure that we're individuals who don't just believe in Jesus, but who continue in his word, who are trying to put into action the things which he teaches. Because to not do so would have what's called a dead faith. We already have faith, but we need to be sure that we have actions to back that faith up as well. Now, here's what he says in verse 32 concerning his teaching. He says, "And you will know the truth, and the truth will make you free." If we continue in his word, we're disciples of his, and then we'll know the truth, and truth makes us free. This is what he's telling these individuals who believed in him all the way back in John chapter 8. So they answered him. I think it's important to point out that he's having a dialogue with believers. He's not talking to the Pharisees and the scribes and the Sadducees anymore, but he's talking to the believers, people that had believed his message. All right? I think sometimes I read this passage and I think that Jesus must be talking about the Pharisees and the Sadducees, but he's not. He's talking to people that had already begun to believe in him in this section. Now, it's true that he was talking to individuals who didn't believe in him in the previous section, but at the very end of it, in verse 30, it says there, he spoke these things, many came to believe in him. And then he goes on and he's talking to these believers in verse 31. So notice this in verse 32. He says, "You will know the truth, and the truth will make you free." So although they had believed Jesus up to this point in verse 31, they had yet to be made free. And then he says this in verse 33. They answered him, "We are Abraham's descendants and have never yet been enslaved to anyone. How is it that you say you will become free?" Isn't it interesting that they had made this claim that they had never been enslaved to anybody, forgetting their past, forgetting Egypt, forgetting Babylon, forgetting Assyria. And so they want to know what Jesus means by this. How is it that we'll become free? So Jesus answers in verse 34, and he says, "Truly, truly, I say to you, everyone who commits sin is the slave of sin. The slave does not remain in the house forever. The Son does remain forever. So if the Son makes you free, you will be free indeed." That's verses 34 through verse 36. So he says, he switches gears on him here in verse 34. He says, "I'm not talking about as if you're enslaved to a man." He says, "I'm talking about that you're enslaved to sin. This is the real problem that you have, because everyone who commits sin is the slave of sin." Let's go take a look at Romans chapter 6 here for a moment. In Romans chapter 6, Paul says something very similar to this. He says in verse 16, Romans chapter 6 and verse 16, he says, "Do you not know that when you present yourselves to someone as slaves for obedience, you are slaves of the one whom you obey, either of sin resulting in death or of obedience resulting in righteousness?" He goes on to say in verse 17, "But thanks be to God that you, though you were slaves to sin, you became obedient from the heart to that form of teaching to which you were committed. And having been freed from sin, you became slaves of righteousness." So in verses 16 through 18, and even on down past that in Romans 6, Paul is talking about the idea that they have two options. They can enslave themselves to sin, or they can be servants of God. And this is the gist of what Jesus is saying in John chapter 8. Everyone who commits sin is the slave of sin. Now, who hasn't committed sin? Anybody? Just Jesus, right? So it means everybody at some point in their life is a slave to sin. Even though they might be raised in the church, even though they might grow up attending Bible studies, going to youth group things or church camp things, whatever it might be, everybody eventually sins. And because of that, everyone needs a redeemer, someone to buy them back out of sin. So this is what he says in verse 36. "So if the Son makes you free, you will be free indeed." Notice that word "indeed" there that's found at the end of verse 36. You will be indeed truly. You'll be indeed for certain. So what he's saying is, yes, they had a type of freedom as descendants of Abraham. They had one type of freedom, but really the Son can make them free in a whole new way, in a real way, free indeed. A freedom that goes beyond who you serve as a nation. So one of the things that we have to keep in mind is that Jesus is not talking about physical bondage here, just like he wasn't talking about physical birth in John 3, just like he wasn't talking about physical water in John 4, just like he wasn't talking about physical bread in John 6 and more water in John 7. There's all these examples we have, and Jesus is talking spiritually as well here. Because Jesus, as we pointed out, is leading them on a new type of exodus. I've pointed out to you already how in John 6, 7, and 8, Jesus identifies himself in three ways: as bread, as water, and as light. Three gifts that were prevalent in the time of the Exodus. And now in John 8, he says, you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. What he's doing is he's pronouncing to them a new type of exodus. An exodus that's not rooted in physical things like what they had in Egypt, but it's rooted in spiritual things or heavenly things like what we have in Christ. So he says, if the Son makes you free, you will be free indeed. Now, look here at verse 32. He says in verse 32, you'll know the truth, and the truth will make you free. But in verse 36, he says, if the Son makes you free, you'll be free indeed. I can't help but point out what Jesus says a few chapters later in John 14 in verse... John 14 and verse 6. He says, I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father but through me. So when Jesus says you'll know the truth and the truth will make you free, that's why he goes on to say, if the Son makes you free, you'll be free indeed. Because Jesus is the Word. Jesus is the truth. Jesus is the way. Jesus is the life. So in John, when we come across these terms like truth, way, word, life, or light, we can see how those things are identified as Jesus himself. It's Jesus that makes us free. Now, in verse 37, he says this, I know that you are Abraham's descendants, yet you seek to kill me because my word has no place in you, or has made no progress within you. I speak the things which I have seen with my Father, therefore you also do the things which you've heard from your father. And keep in mind that Jesus seems to be talking to people here that have already begun to believe in him in verse 31. And yet, just believing in him did not mean that they had been born again, like what Jesus talked to Nicodemus. Nicodemus believed in Jesus, but Nicodemus had not yet been born again. There's a difference between believing in Christ and being born again, because even the devils believe and tremble. Being born again is about a complete life transformation. So just because they started to suspect that there was something to what Jesus was saying did not mean that their lives had been transformed by what Jesus was saying just yet. So he tells them that, he says, I speak the things which I have seen with my Father, therefore you also do the things which you've heard from your father. And they answered him and said to him in verse 39, Abraham is our father. Jesus said to them, if you are Abraham's children, do the deeds of Abraham. Notice again the emphasis here on deeds, not just faith. Because anybody can believe in Jesus and mentally acknowledge that Jesus is the Son of God, but we must allow that faith to transform our lives, not just be stagnant. He said, if you're Abraham's children, do the deeds of Abraham. But as it is, you are seeking to kill me, a man who has told you the truth, which I heard from God. This Abraham did not do. You are doing the seeds of your father. Now they said to him in verse 41, we are not born of fornication. We have one Father, God. So this is now they're coming back with another argument. They're basically what they're saying is, we're not born of fornication. our descendants come from Abraham, and God is the father of Abraham, and so God is our father, is the argument that they're making. In other words, they haven't intermingled with the nations like some of the others had done during their time. They had a pure line right back to Abraham, and so their true father was God. It even goes beyond Abraham. So here's what he responds to this claim in verse 42. Jesus said to them, "If God were your father, you would love me, for I proceed forth and have come from God. For I have not even come on my own initiative, but he sent me." So he tells them that if God was your father, then you would believe me. But you must have another father. And he hasn't told them who their father is just yet. Why do you not understand what I'm saying in verse 43? It is because you cannot hear my word. There's a difference between listening to someone and hearing somebody, right? Because how many times have you been able to hear somebody's voice, but you really weren't listening to what they're saying? Right. We've all done it. And Laura can attest to it. Sometimes she talks from the other room, and though I can audibly hear what she's saying, it hasn't registered, what it is that she's actually said. And children are really great about that, aren't they? But he says, why do you not understand what I'm saying? It's because you cannot hear my word. This is why when you get into an argument or a discussion or whatever with somebody about the Bible, and you tell them, just read what it says, sometimes that doesn't work because they're not reading what it says, right? The words are going off the page, and they have an idea of what those words mean, but they might not have the background that you have or the knowledge that you have about that context to even know what the passage is saying, right? They might have a different interpretation. So sometimes when we say just read it and you'll see it, that's not always true, because some people don't read it. They read what they've been taught into what they're reading on the page. And sometimes we can be guilty of that as well. Whenever we read certain passages, we might take what we already believe and put it into the passage before we ever even try to determine what it means objectively. So Jesus said the reason why they couldn't hear what they're saying is because they could not hear. You cannot hear my word. This is one of the reasons why Jesus spoke in parables, as we learn in the other gospel accounts. Now then he goes on and says this in verse 44. You are of your father the devil, and you want to do the desires of your father. He was a murderer from the beginning and does not stand in the truth, because there is no truth in him. Whenever he speaks a lie, he speaks from his own nature, for he is a liar and the father of lies. This is interesting here in verse 44, because he's telling them that they are children of the devil. Now that right there would drive them crazy, because they can trace their lineage back to Abraham. Is he saying that Abraham is a child of the devil as well? Not at all. What he's saying is, even though they have a claim to their lineage, that doesn't mean anything. Just because they can trace themselves back to Abraham doesn't mean that they're children of God. See, what Jesus is doing is he's opening up the people to an entirely new way of thinking. Just because you can trace your lineage back to a certain person, just because you have done these outward religious things, doesn't mean that you're actually a child of God. It just means that you got a good track record and are able to trace your lineage back to Abraham. This is a warning that John the Baptist gave as well in Matthew chapter 3. When he's out preaching and teaching, some of the people came who were Pharisees and Sadducees, and he tells them in verse 9, do not suppose that you can say to yourselves, we have Abraham for our father. For I say to you that from these stones God is able to raise up children to Abraham. In other words, there was another way that they could be, that God could bring about children to Abraham that didn't have to do with a physical lineage. God is able to produce children of Abraham through faith, not through one's lineage. And so he says to them in verse 44, you are of your father the devil, John 8:44. And then he says this in the second part of that verse, he says, he was a murderer from the beginning. So the devil, he said, murdered people from the beginning through a lie. He murdered through a lie. And what's interesting about Jesus is Jesus is coming to offer them freedom, but he's also coming to offer them life. Look at verse 51, just a few verses down, just in case we don't get to it. He says, "Truly, truly, I say to you, if anyone keeps my word, he will never see death." You see? So, the devil murdered them through a lie, but Jesus is offering life through truth. You'll know the truth, and the truth will set you free. You see? So you have on one hand, murder, death, a lie, misunderstanding, they're not able to hear, slavery or bondage. But then you have on the other hand, you have Jesus gives life to answer those two. And he gives life through the truth. And he gives life through understanding the truth. And then he doesn't only give this, but he also gives freedom. You'll know the truth, and the truth will set you free. So these various words that are used here mirror one another here in John chapter 8. On the one hand, you have death and slavery and bondage and darkness and all these other synonyms that are used. And on the other hand, you have life and light and freedom. All right? And so what Jesus is saying here in John chapter 8, that though they're children of the devil, he's come so that they can be born again. He's come so they can have true renewal. And he's come to reverse what Satan had done from the beginning. Now, when we think about all this, and we think back to what happened in the garden, whenever Adam and Eve ate of that forbidden fruit, they didn't die on the spot, did they? Physically. They didn't die on the spot. They were exiled from the garden. And that's what Jesus is talking about here in John 8. He's saying, you're going to be made free. You'll never see death. Now, every single person that listened to Jesus' message that day died physically. But they didn't die in the way that it counts. And this is what, of course, Jesus has in mind when he's given all this. So Jesus is coming to offer freedom, a freedom that goes back beyond Abraham all the way to the beginning when the devil first enslaved humanity through that lie. So this is what Jesus has come to do. He's come to set them free. He's come to set us free. All right. Anybody have any comments up to this point? So look at verse 45. But because I speak the truth, you do not believe me. You do not believe me. Again, that goes back to them not being able to hear. They weren't even able to hear what Jesus was saying. In other words, they weren't able to comprehend it. They weren't able to understand it. Which one of you convicts me of sin? Verse 46. If I speak the truth, why do you not believe me? Now, this is a similar question that was asked at the very beginning of John. Or really, it wasn't really a question, it was just stated. Jesus said there at the very beginning of John, verse 7, he who is without sin among you, let him be the first to throw a stone at her, right? And then he goes on to say in verse 10 to the woman, where are they? Did no one condemn you? So Jesus is asking a similar question about himself here in verse 46. Which one of you convicts me of sin? If I speak truth, why do you not believe me? So there was none there that was willing to pick up a stone because no one there could really find anything wrong with Jesus. They had their problems with him doctrinally, but they couldn't find anything to condemn him by. That's what he means by they were seeking to kill him. In other words, they were trying to find some way to capture him and put him into prison so that he could be put to death. He says, if I speak truth, why do you not believe me? In other words, if the things that I'm saying you can't find anything wrong with, why aren't you accepting them? Now, again, Jesus was primarily addressing here individuals that believed in him, as you saw back there in verse 31. Apparently, though, and I misspoke when I said this, this entire context isn't just about those who believe. When he says that they answered him, I thought that pronoun they answered to the Jews who had believed in him, verse 31. But apparently these are individuals that are responding to Jesus' statements that he made to his disciples. And he's not just talking to people who believe in him, as you see in verse 45. I never noticed that, where he says in verse 31, Jesus was saying to those Jews who had believed him. So I thought I'd test out that hypothesis, but I turned out to be wrong. So sorry about that. So Jesus is speaking to people who believe in him, but people that don't believe in him answer, and this is who he's responding to. That doesn't really change the substance of what's been said at all, but it's just pointing out that,
Then would it be also correct to say that when he said you are the children of the devil,
right,
he's not talking to everybody in the crowd? Or he's talking to
That'd be correct. He's just talking to those who are against him, not those who...
It's not a blanket statement, because there were some that did believe in him and did accept his word.
That's true, and it is true they accepted his word. But it's also true that they still didn't have freedom just yet, because Jesus had yet to die and be raised. So they still were in need of being born again. Yeah. But I wouldn't classify them under the heading children of the devil. The way my Bible worded this was just a little bit odd and threw me off. Okay, let's look at verse 40. Let's see, verse 47. He who is of God hears the words of God. For this reason you do not hear them, because you are not of God. Notice the expression the Jews in verse 48. Up to this point, it just said they, and that's why it threw me off earlier. But now that it says the Jews in verse 48, it lets you know who he has in mind. And whenever Jesus says the Jews, or rather whenever John talks about the Jews, you got to understand he's not talking about the common people. He's talking about the individuals who were the higher-ups, the Pharisees and the Sadducees. This expression, the Jews, is often used in John. And it's been a term or a phrase that's been taken to apply to Jewish people even today as an excuse to persecute and to harass and to belittle. But we mustn't confuse the Jewish leaders of the first century who are persuading the people to not listen to Jesus with individuals who identify as Jewish today, because that's something that many have done in an attempt to even slaughter and commit genocide upon Jewish people, like what they did in World War II. So the Jews answered and said to him, "Do we not rightly say that you are a Samaritan and have a demon?" So this is an interesting turn of events, because up to this point, they all thought that they knew where Jesus had come from, right? We know you're from Nazarene, right? You're a Nazarene from Nazareth, right? So there's no way that you can be the Messiah. Well, now they're saying you are a Samaritan and have a demon. They're trying to tell him that he is the worst of the worst. Not only is he a Samaritan, but he's a Samaritan has a demon. And you can't really get any worse than that, right? Jesus answered, "I do not have a demon, but I honor my Father, and you dishonor me. But I do not seek my glory. There is one who seeks and judges. Truly, truly, I say to you, if anyone keeps my word, he will never see death." Now here's something about verse 50 that I would like to point out. He says, "I do not seek my glory. There is one who seeks and judges." Now, part of Jesus' whole reason for becoming human is because he was humbling himself. Jesus did not die on the cross so that he could be made king. He died on the cross out of love for us, regardless of whether or not he was going to be made king, right? That wasn't his goal in dying. His goal in dying was to show love towards us. God lifted him up and made him king because he humbled himself. And this is what he means by this in verse 50. "I do not seek my glory." Jesus didn't come to the world to lift himself up. He came to the world to humble himself. It was God that did the lifting up. he says here in verse 51, "Truly, truly, I say to you, if anyone keeps my word, he'll never see death." This is a statement that Jesus has made multiple times in John up to this point. He talks about this in John 3. They'll have everlasting life. He talks about this in John 4. If you drink of this water, you'll never die, right? You never go thirsty. He talks about this in John 5. Many of those who heard his word had passed out of death into life. He talks about this in John 6. If you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you'll never taste death. And now he says it again in chapter 8, verse 51. If anyone keeps my word, he'll never see death. Now they've got him because now they're upset because of Abraham. They said in verse 52, "Now we know that you have a demon. Abraham died, and the prophets also. And you say, if anyone keeps my word, he'll never taste of death." See there in verse 52? So they're saying, now Abraham's dead, the prophets are dead. What are you saying? Are you saying that they had, that they were of the devil too? Surely you are not greater than our father Abraham who died. The prophets died too. Who do you make yourself out to be? Jesus says in verse 54, "If I glorify myself, my glory is nothing. But it is my Father who glorifies me, of whom you say he is our God. And you have not come to know him, but I know him. And if you say that I do not know him, I will be a liar like you. Rather, if I say I do not know him, I will be a liar like you. But I do know him and keep his word. Your father Abraham rejoiced to see my day, and he saw it and was glad." In other words, Abraham knew the truth, and the truth would set him free. Abraham looked forward to the time of Christ because he knew that Jesus was the fulfillment of the promises that were made to him 2,000 years before Jesus ever set foot on the earth. That's what he has in mind here. Of course, they have another quarrel with what Jesus is saying here in verse 57. They say, "So the Jews said to him, 'You are not yet 50 years old. Have you seen Abraham?'" They just don't understand. Jesus said to them, "Truly, truly, I say to you, before Abraham was born, I am." And that's that reference to Exodus 3 again in the burning bush. Therefore, they picked up stones to throw at him, but Jesus hid himself and went out of the temple. Jesus was very bold in saying this in verse 58. And he's already said it several times, I am. But they didn't catch on to what he was saying until this very last part, where he said, before Abraham was, I am. In other words, he's in a present state of being. And it was at this word that they wanted to kill him in verse 59, because in saying I am, he's making himself equal with God, saying that he is God in the flesh. And so that was a really, really upsetting thing to them. So Jesus here in John chapter 8 is telling them that he is setting them free from a type of bondage that they didn't even know they had, bondage to sin. And this is something, again, a theme that Paul latches onto in Romans and in Galatians and passages like it, to show them that Jesus had accomplished his mission in setting them free through the gospel. And these several comments that Jesus makes about if you hear his words, you'll never taste death, are really astonishing. Because we've been taught for years and years and years that when we die, we go to Abraham's bosom. We go to a place that God is not, a waiting place, not in God's presence. But Jesus said, if you believe in his word, you'll never taste death. If you believe in me, you'll never die. Do you believe this? In other words, that upon our physical death, we continue to be in the presence of God. So this whole idea that we have to go to a waiting place, what it really is saying is that Jesus didn't do what he said he was going to do and make it so that we're free and so that we never taste death. Because we've been teaching that we have to have another type of resurrection before we can truly go into the presence of God. But that just totally ignores everything that Jesus said. You'll never taste death. You'll never die. That's the promise Jesus made to us. And that's that's the promise that gives us so much hope, even today, whenever we're faced with the loss of a loved one or a loss of a friend, because we know that even though they have died physically, if they're in Christ, they live on and on and on and on. And there's no need for any waiting place or anything like that. Anybody have any comments before we close?
That would also be supported, if we believe that, that would also be supported for what we being condemned for teaching.
Yep, that's right.
You know, because we saying that the grave not going to pop over, the dead not going to be raised up and all that. And the world still believes that that's supposed to happen.
That's what most people believe in the church. But Jesus said you'll never die. So if you never die, then why do you need any more raising if you're never gonna die, right?
Yeah, I think that's
But then how do you square that with it's once appointed the man to die? And
Right.
then the judgment.
What kind of death?
Well, now we're getting it. See, I'm just saying where people would read that.
Oh, yeah,
and say,
yeah.
They have an argument with what you just said. Jesus said
Well-
that if you believe in me, you should never die.
Right.
But then I think it was Paul that came back later and said,
Yeah, Hebrews 9:26, I think, or 20
well,
or
we
20.
consider them to be
28?
writing Hebrews, right?
Yeah. It's appointed a man wants to die after this judgment. Well, yeah, that's what their argument was, wasn't it? Because they said, well, Abraham and all the prophets, they all died. You know, are you saying that you're greater than Abraham? That was their exact response.
Mm-hmm.
So, if anyone were to bring that passage up in that discussion, then you would just go back here to John 8 and you'd say, well, look, there's no difference in what you're saying than what they said about Abraham and the prophets. And every single Christian since Jesus said those words has died physically. But as he points out, he's talking about a different type of life, as you know. But that's what I meant by hearing what he said, right? There's one, we can read the words on the page, but it's another thing to hear what he said. Johnny?
I think that's was also, I think what Paul said, we pass from death to life, the transition to take place from here, when you'll be eyes to there. I think Paul was right, was Philippians he's right to, what he was saying that he was between a rock and a hard place, you know, one
That's
day
right.
I want to be with y'all, I know you need me, but hey, to me to be dead, hey, I'll be with the presence of Christ.
That's right. He said, I'm straight betwixt to do, having a desire to depart and to be with Christ, which is far better. For staying in the flesh is, good for you, but if I die, I can be with Christ. That's right. That's right. So physical death is not what Jesus had in mind. He had in mind spiritual death.
Yeah, because I think this was a lot of the old teaching is. I guess people pull this from that is when a loved one pass on, they put them in the best apparel you can put in, because the dead in Christ supposed to rise, and you don't want to rise up with them tattered clothes on.
Well, you'll rise up with tattered clothes anyways.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'll tell you all a funny story. It's like